Chapter 8. Entertainment. England is famous around the world for its great culture and entertainment. Some of the world's greatest writers, best films, and most famous actors and directors have come from England. And there are several hundred theatres and concert halls showing wonderful plays, music and dance. Literature is a very important part of England's history, and all around the country you can visit the homes of some of the many great English writers. The most famous of these is, of course, William Shakespeare, but many others have written great works of literature too. In the late 17th century, there were some fine poets, for example, John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. Novels only began to be widely written in the 18th century, and one of the earliest of these was Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, which continues to be very popular today. The first half of the 19th century was famous for the romantic poetry of writers like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley and Keats. Jane Austen was another great writer of this time. In books like Emma, Pride and Prejudice, and Persuasion, Austen wrote about how women saw society, marriage, and happiness. Famous Victorian writers included Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot. In Victorian times, people began for the first time to write literature just for children, and one of the best known of these new children's books was Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which continues to be read by many children even today. Another writer from around this time, whose work is much loved now, is Arthur Conan Doyle, who was Scottish. He wrote stories about Sherlock Holmes, a London detective, between 1880 and 1907. Sherlock Holmes had a brilliant mind and was able to find the answers to the strangest mysteries. The stories of these mysteries were told to the reader by Sherlock Holmes's great friend, Dr. Watson. An important English writer at the beginning of the 20th century was Thomas Hardy. Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Far from the Madding Crowd, and Hardy's other novels were often terribly sad stories about people in an imaginary county called Wessex. Rudyard Kipling was also popular at this time, and from 1910, a new kind of modernist literature became important. One of the first modernist writers was Joseph Conrad, who was Polish but lived in England. And between the two wars, there was a lot of other new literature, from writers like Virginia Woolf, Evelyn Waugh, and D.H. Lawrence. After the Second World War, two of England's most important writers were George Orwell, who wrote 1984 and Animal Farm, and Agatha Christie, who wrote 66 detective novels, including The Adventures of Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot. Modern fantasy literature, writing about magic, monsters and other imaginary things, became popular at this time too, when The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien was published in 1949. Two of the most famous writers of the last 50 years are children's writers. Roald Dahl, who was born in Wales to Norwegian parents, wrote books such as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Matilda, many of which also became great films and theatre shows. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, a group of 7 fantasy books for children, has sold hundreds of millions of copies, and people can now read them in 67 different languages. Many of these works of literature have become famous plays, and for many people, an important part of any visit to England is a trip to the theatre. There are several hundred theatres in England, around the country, but the most famous are the theatres of the West End in London. In the West End, there is a theatre on nearly every street, showing the latest plays and musicals, and many of the best actors from all around the world come to perform here. Some of the most famous shows in the West End have been musicals, such as Cats and Phantom of the Opera by Andrew Lloyd Webber. But in London and around the country, you can also see many different kinds of shows, including more serious plays, new works, and comedy. One of the oldest theatres in London is the Old Vic, which first began to show plays in 1818. England also has the National Theatre, on London's South Bank, near the London Eye, which opened in 1976. Across the Thames are the Royal Ballet and the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden, and the English National Opera at the Coliseum, the largest theatre in London. Outside London, England's most famous theatre is the Theatre of the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare's plays are performed throughout the year. In the summer, you can also see Shakespeare's plays at the Globe Theatre in London, a round theatre with no roof, like the one where these famous plays were first performed more than 400 years ago. England is important for its music too. George Friedrich Handel, Edward Elgar, and Gustav Holst are three of the country's most famous classical music composers. And at places like the Royal Festival Hall and the Barbican Centre in London, you can hear many different kinds of classical music played by some of the finest orchestras in the world. There is also a lot of good classical music outside London. The Birmingham Symphony Orchestra is one of the best in Europe. And at many stately homes and castles around the country, there are outdoor concerts in the summer. But it is for its pop music that England is best known. Together with the USA, the UK brought rock and roll to the world in the 1950s, and the Beatles, who became popular in the 1960s, is one of the most famous bands in the world. During the 1960s, the Rolling Stones, Cliff Richard and the Shadows, The Who, The Kinks, The Animals, and many other bands became important in England. And they started to become famous in the USA too. For a while, the USA began to follow the UK in music and in fashion. In the 1970s, music changed. First, there was glam rock from artists like David Bowie and Elton John, who coloured their hair and wore strange and wonderful clothes and shoes. Then came punk rock, short, fast songs, often with a political message, sung by bands like The Clash. In the 1980s, world music, heavy metal, loud, hard music, and indie rock were popular. And England's dance music culture also began. But in the late 1990s, some artists turned against the many fashions in music of the 80s and early 90s, and Britpop arrived. Bands such as Blur, Oasis, and Radiohead that followed the British guitar music of the 1960s and 70s. Several of these bands became famous around Europe and in the USA. Today, you can see bands play in clubs in almost every big city, and there are also music festivals around the country where people camp and watch music in big fields. The most famous of these is at Glastonbury. Art lovers can find a lot to enjoy in England too. Two of England's most famous artists were the landscape painters John Constable and J.M.W. Turner, and many of their pictures can be seen at the Tate Britain Gallery in London. London also has the Tate Modern, of course, and there are also great exhibitions at the Royal Academy of Arts and a lot of Western European art at the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. In the 1990s, a group of artists called the Young British Artists, YBAs, became very popular in England. One of the most famous YBAs was Damien Hirst, who made a lot of artworks with dead animals. Some people love his work, and others hate it. Most towns in England have a cinema, and watching films is a very popular activity for English people. England has made some of the world's greatest films, and some of the most famous actors and directors are English. The film industry only really started in England in the 1930s, when some famous films like The 39 Steps were made. But it was in the 1950s and 1960s that British cinema became really important. At this time, hammer horror films like The Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula were made, and Ealing comedies like Kind Hearts and Coronets and Whiskey Galore. The first Carry On film was made in 1958, and by 1992 there were 31. The Carry On films were comedies that made jokes about English life. They were not thought of as important films, but were loved by many English people. The James Bond films were another series that became very famous in England. The stories were adventures about James Bond, a Secret Service agent, someone who worked secretly for the government, looking for enemies of the country. The first Bond film, Dr. No, was made in 1962, and the films became famous for their music, Bond's cars and clever equipment, and for James Bond himself, a character played by several different actors. A famous English actor of the 1960s was Julie Andrews, who appeared in two famous musical films, The Sound of Music and Mary Poppins. But many people believe that the greatest actor of the 20th century was Laurence Olivier. Olivier, who worked in theatre and film from the 1920s until the 1980s, made nearly 60 films, including Rebecca and Wuthering Heights. Also very famous, but as a director, not an actor, was Alfred Hitchcock. He made many great mystery films in England and in Hollywood, where he later went to live. From the 1990s, romantic comedies like Four Weddings and a Funeral and Notting Hill were made, and the Merchant Ivory films of classic novels like Howard's End. Since then, some of England's most successful films have been Love Actually, Slumdog Millionaire, and the Harry Potter series. But England's most popular kind of entertainment is television. Public television first began in England in 1936, and the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, is the world's oldest and largest broadcaster. Today, there are 5 main channels in England, and there are also hundreds more channels on cable and satellite TV. There are hundreds of radio stations too. On English TV, there are many different kinds of programs, but some of the most popular ones are sitcoms, situation comedies, comedies about people in their home or where they work. One of the most famous of these was Fawlty Towers, with the actor John Cleese. Many people also enjoy soap operas, dramas which continue from one program to the next. For example, EastEnders, Coronation Street, Emmerdale and Hollyoaks. Another very popular drama series in England in the 1990s was Inspector Morse, about a detective in Oxford. Many people also enjoy reality programs about ordinary people's lives. One of the most famous of these is Big Brother, a program in which a group of people live together in a house and are filmed 24 hours a day. Some of the Big Brother programmes have been watched by up to 6 million people in the UK. England has great music, art, history and literature. But sometimes people are most interested in day-to-day life.